Here we are. So I'm going to talk about spirituality, grief, and continuing bonds. And if you don't know about continuing bonds, we're going to get to that in a few moments. I want to start with spirituality. And spirituality really is difficult to define. And it means different things to different people. But it has something to do with our essence. Some people call it soul. Some people call it spirit. Some people call it consciousness. It also has something to do with relationships. And it starts with the relationship to ourselves, and it moves into relationships with others, family, community. It also has something to do with the natural world and how we relate to that. And it also has something to do with how we relate to the divine. It also has something to do with the most important questions we ask about being alive. We call these existential questions. Who am I? How do I make sense of the human condition? The Buddhists talk about the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows. We do really well with the joys. Those that confound us. And grief is a lot about sorrow. And it's not that far away from us if we ever delude ourselves to thinking that things are going to be fine here forever, because they're really not. There are ups and downs all over the place. We've had fires, we've had floods, we have COVID. Look at Eastern Europe with Ukraine. And there's a lot of joy in the world too, but we have to negotiate both of them. It also has something to do with transcendence. What happens to me and everyone I know at the end of this human life? Is there an afterlife? And is it good? Or is it hellish? And will I see my loved ones again, ever, after human death? At the heart of spirituality is meaning making. And this is on us. How do we live authentically to live out our essence? How do we live in accordance with our deepest values? That has something to do with doing. All of this is worked out in relationship. And the great wisdom traditions provide a great many philosophies and practices, and religion is quintessential in guiding us as well, because it brings us together as communities to help us make sense and give us a map for living the most meaningful lives we can. But there is something about loss, death, that will always come up in our life. There's no escaping it. But these trigger grief processes. And as I've already mentioned, as we've heard, our grief is activated right now because of what we've been through and continue to be, and hopefully not too much longer, or maybe it's over. But the point being is COVID has awakened us to all of this. We know the numbers, but one that really strikes me is 9 million people during the COVID era have lost a significant relationship. That is a huge grief. And the spiritual challenge that comes up with this is, how do we make sense of our lives, of our world, with this amount of grief around us, and this amount of suffering and loss? I am a psychotherapist. I specialize in grief and bereavement. And these are the questions that come across my consultation room and everyone else who's in mental health right now, who's dealing with the loss. Where is my deceased loved one? Are they alive somewhere? Are they happy? Are they safe? Do they exist? Will I ever see them again? And then the questions continue. What will happen to me and everyone I love? The path is clear for all of us. These are spiritual existential questions. And if we lean into this state of pessimism, which is actually a natural part of grief. Do not resist it, because you usually come right out of it if you breathe into it. But what is the point of life if we're all going to die anyway? These are profound existential questions. A client came into my office. She had just lost her husband suddenly and tragically. And she said, I just don't get it. He was here, just here. I was talking to him. Now he's gone. How does such a big energy like that just disappear? These are spiritual questions evoked by grief. How do we respond clinically or as just a community members and family members to our loved ones who are going through this? Pain and suffering is a healthy response when we lose someone we love. And grief is the price we pay for loving deeply. Traditional grief therapy, which we're gradually moving away from, I think more and more those in the mental health profession know that this is something of yesteryear, but we have to realize this is where we started culturally. That grief was something that we were trained to go through, let go of, and move on. How many times have you heard, when is so-and-so going to get over that? When is she going to get back to normal after the loss of her husband or whoever? But you know, letting go of our own flesh and blood or our lifetime partners, that's too big of an ask. And I don't think it's a healthy one either. We need to do it differently, and fortunately, there are new therapies and more ways of looking at grief and bereavement that help us do this. And this is continuing bonds. This is a whole new way of looking at grief and bereavement. This invites us to renegotiate, recraft our relationships with our deceased on our own terms, based on our own interpretation of the communication we are getting, perhaps from across the veil, from the deceased. Shared crossings. I'm the founder of the Shared Crossing Project, and I actually crafted this term, end-of-life phenomena that suggest loving communication across the veil and ongoing connection with our departed loved ones. That is radical in medical mental health, but I don't think it is to most in the room here. This is what we study. These are all these end-of-life phenomena and experiences. I'm not going to spend much time on them. I'm going to invite us to focus on the top one you see there, shared death experiences, and post-death visions and visitations, because we're going to have a few case studies on that right now. We're going to begin with Adela, and she's going to have a shared death experience with her father. And I'm going to tell you what a shared death experience it is if you haven't heard. It's this experience where the caregiver loved ones express that they feel like they shared in the journey with the deceased, with the dying, into and through, or through and into a benevolent afterlife. So we're going to listen to Adela here. Once again, she's at the, and by Adela, many may know her. She was a very well-respected family therapist in Santa Barbara for over 3 decades.
My father, who was, as I just described, an ex-Catholic, was also a deeply spiritual man, although he couldn't identify himself that way because of his, reaction to his early upbringing. But we were very close, and as I became spiritually awake and started to use that language, he would sort of look at me and say, oh, if you need to believe that stuff, that's okay. In the last years of his life, he knew he was passing. We had moments of deep spiritual connection in frameworks that were in neither frame of reference. They were mostly like we'd be out looking at the stars together, and there would be a moment of real connectedness about the bigness and beauty of the universe. I would say to him, listen, I know you don't believe any of this, but when you leave your body, go into the light. And so even if you don't believe this, at least keep this in mind, have an open mind. And we would joke about this, right? So when he passed, my mother and I cared for him at home. We were his full-time caregivers. It was a good passing. We loved him through it. And she came into I was just in the room next door. She was sleeping in a cot in the room where he was. And she said, I think he's gone. There's no breath. You know? So I walked in and he was not in his body anymore. My mother left the room for a moment and I saw him as clearly as I see you now, standing in a right, you know, slightly elevated, but in the corner of the room there. And I said to him, go into the light. And he started laughing. And it was the most beautiful, amazing moment between us. So many rich layers of things coming together, right? And I was laughing and he was laughing and then he was gone. It's beautiful.
So there's Adela having a shared death experience, seeing her father moments after he had died, and he was happy. And they communicated. That is a shared death experience. Adela has another experience, post-death visitation from her father a few months after he died, and we're going to listen to that too.
He appeared to me in meditation about 6 months after his passing. It's the first time I had contact with him on the other side. But he appeared to look like he was about 40 years old. He was younger. Surprised me. I'd never given this thought, right? So I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. He had a smoking jacket on. I don't know if you even know what that means from the Hollywood days, right? And he had that kind of glamour look. So my dad was an assistant director at Warner Brothers back in the day when he met my mom, who was an actress. It was a very romantic story. And I think he appeared in that phase of his life. That's the way he chose to represent himself to me. And I thought it was really funny, but and delightful. But I also thought, isn't that interesting? I guess you get to choose your form. That had never occurred to me before.
And that's often what we see, is that our deceased loved ones come back in visions and visitations, and they present themselves in a rather vain way, actually. Very young, very vibrant, very healthy, and very happy. So, what do we say to Adela as mental health practitioners? You know what we say? Thank you for sharing this with us. Because you know what? 56% of the bereaved report that they are visited by their deceased loved ones in some way. Seeing the person as Adela saw, hearing, smelling, touching, sense presence. And our afterlife beliefs are actually widespread and common. Most major spiritual traditions have a sense of an afterlife, and some articulate it quite well. 74% of American adults believe in an afterlife. 59% of medical doctors also believe in an afterlife. And yet, in the therapy rooms, the data speaks something not very positive, and that is that most clients, patients, when they share these shared crossing experiences of contact with their deceased relatives, they don't have a satisfactory response. They feel like they either weren't understood or in some cases dismissed. And yet we know as a psychotherapeutic community that the role of religion and spirituality and psychological health and the ethical integration into psychotherapy have been thoroughly examined over the past decades. However, afterlife beliefs continue to be neglected in these discussions. There's something about our culture that is not welcoming these experiences. And so I say to all of us, not just as therapists, but also as community members, as loving family members, we need to support the bereaved in having evolving relationships with the deceased. Affirm this contact and this connection across the veil. Engage their spiritual processes of meaning making to continue to keep these relationships alive and well in healthy ways. And I want to say that this is an invitation or a challenge to our culture. Let us wake up to the fact that grief is a community event. Let us share these spiritual experiences, these shared crossings, with our family members, over dinner, at parties. Let's talk about what we are experiencing across the veil. And let's let these stories illuminate the most precious spiritual connections, spiritual questions we have. Namely, who are we? And where do we go after this human life? And let's let grief be the doorway to spiritual connection with our departed loved ones and an invitation to spiritual transformation. And that, I put forth humbly, is the wisdom of grief. Thank you.